It was late October, right when the cold really starts to settle in, making the tile floor perpetually icy. I was 22, trying to save up for community college, and the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift paid slightly better, mostly because nobody else wanted it. My shift partner, Maya, had a dry wit and treated the absurdity of retail like a philosophical game. We spent nights wiping down stainless steel counters, counting the change drawer, and listening to lo-fi music, occasionally interrupted by a car at the drive-thru. The phone, an old beige relic tied to an outdated PABX system, sat by the register, rarely used except for internal transfers or delivery inquiries. Around 2:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, the phone rang, piercing the stillness. I answered. "Thank you for calling the Grindhouse. How can I help you?" Silence. Just a faint hiss of static and heavy, deliberate breathing, like someone listening intently, holding their breath between sighs. I hung up, assuming it was a prank. Maya shrugged it off, but the call felt unsettling. Not like a typical prank with giggles or insults, just a presence. The calls became a pattern, always between 2:30 a.m. and 4 a.m., in clusters of 3 or 4, with the same rhythmic breathing and occasional clicks. We nicknamed the caller Gasper. I mentioned it to our manager, Tony, who dismissed it as static or pranks, too focused on inventory to care. Maya and I tried joking about it, even yelling at Gasper once, but the calls persisted, sometimes with agitated breathing or a quick click, like a recording device. One Friday, while scrubbing a mixer bowl, I dropped it, the loud clang echoing through the store. 10 seconds later, the phone rang. Maya answered, and her face froze. She whispered that after the breathing stopped, she heard a sound, like something rolling on tile, and a faint, distorted whisper. "Clean that up." I dropped the bowl behind the counter, out of sight from windows. The caller knew what had happened. We checked the security cameras, grainy, inaccessible VHS loops, and the parking lot, finding nothing. The isolation of the store felt like a trap. We suspected the PABX system was bugged, turning the phone into an always-on microphone. At 3:45 a.m., another call came. I moved a napkin dispenser slightly, and after a pause, a metallic squeal preceded a chilling word. Right. The caller was watching our every move. We stopped talking openly, whispering only about trivial things to confuse the listener. The calls, the flickering lights in the storage hallway where we checked the PABX cabinet, and the growing dread made the store feel alive with malice. Then, at 4 a.m., a muffled, digitized voice said, "Too much guilt." My stomach dropped. A month earlier, I'd agonized over selling my grandmother's antique pocket watch to help my sister Sarah's debt, a private struggle I'd only shared with Sarah and my friend Mark, far from the store. The caller knew my deepest secrets. Maya and I realized our phones, maybe our lives, were compromised. We were trapped in a psychological nightmare, watched and judged by an unseen observer who knew too much. Panic set in. Maya grabbed her cell phone, insisting we call the police, but I argued they'd dismiss it as a prank. How could we prove someone was tapping an ancient phone system to torment us with personal secrets? Every passing car or rustling leaf outside felt like a threat. At 4:30 a.m., desperate, Maya suggested overloading the phone line to disrupt the listener. She called the store phone from her cell, creating a feedback loop of static and dial tone. We hoped it would jam their connection. By 5:30 a.m., with dawn breaking, the call stopped, and we dared to hope we'd won. But then Maya's phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "Feedback is rude. Turn it down, Maya." They knew our plan, our names, and were watching in real time, even through her personal phone. The store felt like a cage, its systems weaponized against us. At 5:58 a.m., the phone rang again. Against Maya's pleas, I answered, determined to confront the caller. "You're done," I said into the receiver, my voice low and firm. "We're calling the police. We have evidence." There was no breathing, no static, no digitized warning. Instead, there was a sound, faint and clear, that made my stomach drop out completely. It was the distinct, melancholic sound of a music box melody, specifically the tune of Lullaby, a tune my late grandmother used to hum to me when I was a child, a tune I had never shared with anyone, not even Maya or Sarah, a tune that was forever locked in my childhood memory. The melody played for exactly 4 seconds, ending on a discordant, high-pitched scrape like a rusty needle being pulled across vinyl. Then, the line went dead. I hung up, feeling cold, exposed, and deeply, irrevocably violated. The surveillance wasn't just physical or digital. It felt like psychic intrusion. The morning crew arrived 2 minutes later, cheerful and oblivious, complaining about the early hour. I quit the next day, claiming I found a better job. Maya quit a week later. To this day, every time my personal phone vibrates with an unknown number, or when a light flickers in a room, I feel that same suffocating fear. The man we called Gasper proved that there is no such thing as privacy, and that the greatest terror is the feeling that someone, somewhere, knows everything about the guilt you carry and the lullabies you remember. That was the first lesson I learned working the graveyard shift. The dark isn't empty, it's listening. After the terror of the grindhouse, I found a job that promised less midnight madness, working at a major chain coffee divided by a sandwich shop called the Daily Bread. This time, I took the closing shift, 4 p.m. to midnight, hoping to avoid the absolute silence of the early morning hours. The Daily Bread was located in a brand new, sterile shopping complex. Everything was white tile, polished chrome, and large, clear, plate glass windows. My manager, Rick, was a former corporate man, meticulous, obsessed with efficiency, and completely devoid of personality. The staff was small. There was me, Rick, who rarely stayed past 8 p.m., and Hector, the shift supervisor. Hector was an older man, quiet and meticulous, who had been there since the store opened. He was the calm thinker of the group, a man who saw everything but commented on nothing. The store had been open for about 6 months when the corporate mandate came down. Switch out the old safe for a new, next-generation security model. The safe was located in the back corner of the tiny manager's office, hidden behind a cheap, framed print of a Tuscan vineyard. The old safe was a massive, bolted-down black square, heavy and intimidating. When the security contractor came in to remove the old safe, Hector and I were tasked with supervising the office area after closing, ensuring nothing was disturbed. The contractors, 2 silent, massive men in overalls, worked for nearly 2 hours, chipping away at the drywall and concrete surrounding the safe's base. The dust was thick and pervasive. As they finally managed to wrench the old safe out of the wall with a loud, grinding sound, a section of the surrounding dry wall, which had clearly been sealed up years before the store was built, collapsed inward. A smell immediately flooded the office. It wasn't the smell of old concrete or dust. It was a dense, cloying odor, a mix of decay, damp cloth, and something sour and metallic, like old pennies and stagnant water. It was the smell of something sealed off and long forgotten. Hector and I exchanged a look of pure, bewildered apprehension. The contractors paused, looking equally disturbed by the stench. In the gaping void left by the removal of the safe, where the wall shouldn't have been hollow, we could see a small, dark recess, a hidden compartment, maybe 3 feet deep, situated behind where the old safe had been anchored. The space was lined with old, stained wallpaper, a floral pattern that definitely wasn't Daily Bread decor. It suggested that this building, or at least this wall, had belonged to something else entirely, maybe decades ago. "What is that?" one of the contractors mumbled, pulling off his respirator. Hector stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He shone his phone flashlight into the recess. The light illuminated the compartment. It was empty, save for 3 distinct items clustered together on the dusty floor. The first was a small, mildewed leather journal, its pages fused together by moisture and time. The second was a tangle of thick, black fishing line or thin rope, tied in several complex, non-standard knots. The third item was what made my blood run cold. It was a single, rusted, child-sized roller skate, resting on its side. It looked like the kind of metal skate with leather straps, utterly archaic and eerily small. Hector reached in, carefully picked up the roller skate by the wheel, and held it up to the light. The stench intensified, hitting us with a suffocating wave of rotten age. "We need to call Rick," I said immediately, stepping back toward the office doorway. This was definitely outside the scope of sanitizing the condiment stations. Hector didn't move. He simply stared at the roller skate, then at the hole in the wall. "Alex," he said, his voice flat and low. "Do you know what this building used to be?" I shook my head. The shopping complex was new. It was built on what I assumed was a demolished industrial site. "It was a library for 20 years, Hector said, turning the skate over in his hand. "Before that, from the late 60s to the early 70s, it was a family restaurant, a pizza place. And before that," he paused, lowering the skate slowly. "Before that, it was a very small private daycare center. It closed suddenly in 1959. There was some kind of local scandal. The implications were instantaneous and terrifying." Rick arrived 20 minutes later, predictably annoyed that his pristine corporate efficiency had been interrupted by structural anomalies. He immediately focused on the roller skate. "Good God, the OSHA violation potential is through the roof. We need to bag this, disinfect the area, and call waste management. This is not our problem." But Hector insisted on looking closer at the compartment. While Rick was frantically dialing the district manager, Hector carefully pulled out the waterlogged journal and the tangled rope. The rope was odd. It was too thick for common string, but too thin for real climbing rope. It felt greasy and brittle. The knots were unnerving, not the simple slip knots you'd use daily, but complicated, layered ties, like elaborate snares. "These are securing knots," Hector observed quietly, running his fingers over the stiff fibers. "Used to keep something from moving, not to connect two objects." The journal was the key. Rick, convinced it contained sensitive historical records that could compromise the property value, insisted on opening it then and there, despite the decay. We carefully pried the covers apart. The pages were mostly illegible, blobs of black ink and water stains. But near the center, protected slightly by the thickness of the leather, was a small section of writing that had miraculously survived the dampness. The script was tight, elegant, cursive, written with a shaky hand. It seemed to be a diary entry, undated. I read it aloud, struggling to decipher the script in the office's harsh spotlight. "And she has started to smell. The change is too fast. He won't let me leave the room. He says we have to keep the change secret, or they will take the project away. I don't know who they are anymore. I just know the smell won't wash off. I keep trying to tie the knots the way he showed me, to keep it all contained, but she keeps slipping free." The journal ended there, the following pages completely disintegrated. The office was dead silent, save for Rick's heavy breathing. The smell, which had dissipated slightly, seemed to return, sharper now that we understood the contents of the hidden space. "What in the hell?" Rick muttered, horrified less by the content than by the potential liability. "The knots," Hector whispered, pointing at the rope. "They relate to the journal. The writer was trying to tie something up." "Maybe a pet?" I suggested, desperate for a normal explanation. Hector shook his head slowly. "If it were a pet, why the child's skate? And why the extreme secrecy implied in the journal? This sounds like someone was held here, or something was being kept here." The feeling of stepping into someone else's unfinished nightmare was intense. The store, with its cheerful menu boards and pristine machines, suddenly felt like a thin veneer over a dark, painful history. Rick, in full managerial panic, insisted that the contractors seal the hole immediately. "Everything goes into a hazmat bag, and we forget we ever saw it. We were here to install a safe. Nothing more. Is that clear?" He threatened our jobs, emphasizing the need for discretion regarding unauthorized debris. We nodded, but the image of the roller skate and the words "she has started to smell" were permanently etched in our minds. The contractor cemented the new safe into the wall, completely burying the compartment and its dark secrets. We cleaned the dust, disinfected the office, and tried to return to the rhythm of wiping down counters. But the smell lingered. It wasn't just in the office. It seemed to drift into the main store area. It was faint, but distinct, metallic and earthy, fighting the powerful smell of fresh baked bread and vanilla syrup. For the next few nights, the odor was palpable near the back of the store, around the preparation sink. Customers didn't seem to notice, but Hector and I did. We called it the change smell. Hector became withdrawn, constantly staring at the wall where the safe was now bolted. I found myself obsessively wiping down surfaces, trying to scrub away the historical grime that was now psychologically staining the store. The real fear began 2 nights after the discovery. The Daily Bread was a fortress of cleanliness, designed to be impersonal and transient. But the history we had unearthed refused to stay buried beneath the fresh concrete and polished steel. The pressure began on the 3rd night. Rick had left promptly at 7:30 p.m., leaving Hector and me to manage the closing sequence. The smell was noticeably stronger, not just near the office, but permeating the air around the back counter where we prepped the sandwiches. It was faintly metallic, mixed with that sour, damp scent. "It's psychosomatic, Alex," Hector told me that night, wiping down the panini press. He was trying to sound rational, but his eyes kept darting toward the storage hallway leading to the office. "The cement is still curing. It's leaching odors." But I knew it wasn't the cement. The smell seemed to move with the air currents, always strongest when the vents kicked on or when the external door opened. It felt less like a residue and more like a diffusion. Around 10:45 p.m., I was alone at the front counter, counting tips. Hector was sweeping the dining room. The store was empty. I heard the first sound. It was soft, repetitive, and completely out of place. It sounded like a slight scuffing, the friction of stiff rubber or leather dragging lightly across a tiled surface. Scuff, scuff, scuff. It came from the direction of the back office, specifically the wall where the safe was installed. I froze, listening intently. The sound was so faint I thought it was the air conditioning unit cycling, but the A divided by C always had a steady, mechanical thrum. This was organic, irregular. Scuff, scuff, stop. Then, a low, dull thud, like a heavy tennis ball dropped onto carpet. I walked slowly back toward the hall. The office door was ajar, as always. The harsh fluorescent light inside highlighted the new, gleaming safe. The wall around it was newly painted white, stark against the dark metal. "Hector?" I called out softly. "Back here, Alex," he replied from the dining room, his voice muffled by distance. I pushed the office door open. The metallic scent was overpowering here. I looked directly at the safe, my heart hammering. Everything was exactly as we had left it. The wall was smooth, the bolts secure, but there it was again. A quick, scraping noise that seemed to originate from inside the wall, behind the safe, exactly where the compartment had been sealed. It sounded like whatever was tied up with those fishing line knots was shifting its weight, struggling against its bonds. I walked right up to the wall, ignoring the stench, and placed my hand flat against the cool drywall next to the safe. The scraping stopped immediately. I stood there for 3 minutes, not moving, holding my breath. I felt the overwhelming fear that I had felt at the grindhouse, the fear of being observed, but this time, the observer was trapped and angry. I slowly pulled my hand away. As soon as I took a step back, the sound resumed, softer this time, almost hesitant. Scuff. Thud. Scuff. It was confirming its presence, responding to my withdrawal. I backed out of the office and found Hector in the dining room, pushing chairs onto tables. I didn't tell him about the sound right away, sensing that voicing it would make it too real, too dangerous. Instead, I focused on the object that linked the journal to the noise, the roller skate. "Hector, why a roller skate?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Why would someone hide a single skate with a diary about tying something up?" Hector paused his sweeping, leaning on the broom handle, looking tired and old. "Alex, look at the time frame. 1959. A closed daycare center. A missing child rumored in local papers that year, but never substantiated. It was quickly suppressed, apparently." He lowered his voice. "The skate wasn't part of a pair, was it? If a child loses one shoe or one skate, it suggests they were pulled away quickly, maybe struggling. And if the journal writer was tying the knots to contain something that was starting to smell..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was brutally clear. The hidden compartment wasn't a repository for secrets, it was a makeshift tomb. And the contents of that tomb, whatever the writer was containing, had been sealed up inside the wall, right behind our new corporate safe. We had released the history, and now, the history was starting to move. The last hour of the shift was agonizing. The scuffing became more insistent, less afraid. It wasn't constant, but it always started when Hector or I were physically closest to the area. I tried to convince myself it was the settling of the building, the old structure reacting to the new weight of the safe. But that didn't explain the smell, or the journal entry, or the fact that the sound stopped the second I touched the wall. At 11:50 p.m., we were completing our final wipe down and polish routine. I was working the narrow strip of floor between the counter and the back door, and Hector was locking up the utility closet. I reached the threshold of the office hallway. The smell was so strong now that it made my eyes water. It felt cold, thick, and suffocating, like breathing air that had passed through decades of rot. I noticed something on the pristine white tile floor directly beneath the seam where the new drywall met the old concrete base, just a foot away from the safe's metal housing. It was a small, dark stain. It wasn't coffee or oil. It was thick and viscous, almost black, but with a slight dull sheen. It looked like old blood that had oxidized and mixed with silt. It was spreading slowly, radiating outward from the wall. I knelt down, stomach churning, and reached out with a paper towel. The substance didn't feel sticky, but oily and cold. And the smell was undeniably coming from it, that metallic, penny-like odor of decay. "Hector!" I hissed, terrified of raising my voice. Hector hurried over, took one look at the fluid, and his face instantly lost all color. Even his inherent calm broke. "No," he breathed, "that's impossible." The contractors had sealed the cavity with cement and drywall. There was no plumbing, no exposed wiring, nothing that should produce a liquid substance in that location. We stared at the oozing stain. It was slow but continuous, evidence of some terrible pressure building inside the sealed compartment, forcing its contents out through the tiniest seam. Driven by a desperate, morbid curiosity, Hector grabbed a pen and gently poked at the edge of the fluid, hoping to push it back toward the wall. As he did, a small, dark object rolled out of the ooze and onto the white tile. It was a knot, a stiff, dark knot, unmistakably made of the same brittle, greasy fishing line we had found next to the roller skate. It was partially covered in the black fluid, but the complicated, strangling coil of the tie was perfectly preserved. She keeps slipping free. The final, terrifying realization hit me. Whatever the journal writer had been trying to contain the change, the smell, the hidden occupant was dissolving, rotting, and escaping the cavity. The knots, which were meant to contain it, were failing and being expelled as the fluid was pushed out. At that exact moment, the faint scuffing sound resumed, louder and more frantic than before, seeming to shift rapidly from one end of the cavity to the other, like something dragging itself against the interior concrete. We didn't wait. We didn't clean the stain. We left the knot on the floor. We ran to the front of the store, locked the doors, punched out on the clock, and didn't look back at the office. We bolted from the store into the cool night air, leaving the lights on and the terrifying sound echoing in the empty, brightly lit corporate shell. We told Rick we were quitting, effective immediately. We offered no explanation beyond vague talk of unexpected family emergencies. Rick was too preoccupied with his inventory spreadsheets to press us. A week later, I drove past the Daily Bread. It looked perfectly normal, sterile, and bright. But I knew that behind the pristine white walls, something was still shifting, still oozing, and still demanding to be let out into the light. The memory of that thick, metallic smell and the sight of that greasy black knot remains the definitive proof that sometimes the past isn't just history. It's a festering presence that only needs a tiny crack to escape. I still can't stand the smell of concrete dust. My next job was at a large, bustling distribution center cafeteria that served food 24/7. It was high volume, low margin work, but the pay was solid. And since it was in an industrial park, there were always dozens of people around a welcome change from the isolated horror of the previous jobs. I worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift again, but this time, the energy was different. The massive warehouse was always running, full of forklift noise and the sound of huge ventilation systems. Isolation wasn't the problem. The problem was the sheer scale and impersonality of the place. My main coworker was David, a grizzled, cynical man in his late 52s. David was a reliable skeptic. If it wasn't tangible and measurable, he dismissed it with a tired groan. The cafeteria kitchen was dominated by the walk-in freezer, a huge industrial unit, roughly the size of a small bedroom, kept at a frigid -20 degrees Fahrenheit. We stored everything in there: bulk meat, frozen vegetables, hundreds of pounds of fries. The freezer had a standard safety release latch inside, glowing green, so you could never be accidentally locked in. Outside, the door was secured by a heavy, spring-loaded latch that required a solid pull to open. One Monday night, David and I were tackling the quarterly deep inventory of the freezer. It was 3:30 a.m. The air outside the freezer felt warm and humid, but inside, the cold was immediate and punishing. We layered up in the thick parkas provided by the facility. We had been inside for about 20 minutes, counting boxes of poultry, when I looked up and saw the freezer door closing. It wasn't slamming shut, it was moving slowly, deliberately, the gap narrowing until the heavy spring latch snicked closed on the outside. The green emergency release light was now our only companion, throwing a sickly glow on the icy floor. "Hey!" I yelled, dropping a box of beef. "Did you close that, David?" David, who had his back to the door, counting labels, turned around and stared at the latch door with the same blank look of shock I must have had. "No, I thought you closed it halfway to keep the heat out." We rushed to the door. We grabbed the internal safety latch, designed to operate with a gentle push, and pulled. It clicked, but the heavy external latch did not release. We pulled harder. Nothing. "What the hell? It's freezing up?" David swore, his breath puffing out white in the limited space. We pulled again, exerting our full weight. The mechanism inside the door felt strained, but the door remained securely fastened from the outside. We started yelling, banging on the thick metal door. But the cafeteria was massive, the industrial fans were loud, and the few warehouse workers still around were too far away, wearing earplugs to drown out the machinery. Panic started to set in. The cold, initially bracing, was now biting. We knew we had a few hours, maybe, before the cold became truly life-threatening. But the thought of that slow, freezing suffocation was instant, searing fear. David finally stopped pulling on the latch and scanned the room wildly. "We need to get someone's attention. Is there a drill or anything in here?" The freezer contained nothing but food. The emergency alarm, I remembered. There was a red, industrial-sized emergency button mounted next to the safety latch. Pressing it was supposed to set off a loud siren in the main kitchen. David and I simultaneously hit the button. Nothing happened. No sound, no light, no indication that the button had registered the contact. It was completely dead. We stared at the unyielding door, the failed latch, and the silent, useless red button. The reality of our situation sank in like a physical weight. We were completely trapped, sealed inside a cryogenic coffin, and someone, or something, had deliberately ensured our only means of communication and escape were nullified. "Someone has to be out there," David whispered, his breath ragged. "This wasn't an accident. The alarm is dead. The latch is stuck." The idea that the alarm was dead felt worse than the cold. It implied foreknowledge and preparation. Someone knew we were doing inventory, knew we would be in there, and had waited for the opportune moment. After 10 minutes of frantic pounding and shouting, we recognized the futility. We conserved energy, huddled together near a pallet of frozen pizzas, desperately trying to keep our core temperature up. "It must be that idiot Frank from the day shift," David muttered, teeth chattering. "He's always pulling pranks. Maybe he jammed the latch from the outside with a piece of metal. If it was a prank, why would he disable the emergency alarm?" I countered, pulling the parka hood tighter around my face. "And where is he now? If he locked us in, he'd be waiting for us to panic." We waited for the sound of laughter, a knock, or even footsteps. Nothing but the ceaseless, low whir of the freezer unit's cooling system. The silence outside the door was maddening. Suddenly, a shadow passed across the small, high, rectangular viewing window built into the door. It was distorted by the thick plastic, but clearly human-shaped. "Someone's there!" David yelled, leaping up and slamming his fist against the door. "Open up! We're freezing!" The shadow paused. It didn't move toward the latch. It simply stood there. Then, slowly, the shadow raised a hand. It pressed a finger against the thick plastic window, right where we could see it. It wasn't Frank. Frank was a jokester, but he was also goofy and loud. This was quiet, deliberate, and sinister. The shadow moved its head down, peering into the freezer through the distorted plastic. Even through the filter of the glass and the cold, I felt a terrible sense of being scrutinized. Then, the hand drew a slow shape on the glass. It drew a jagged vertical line, almost like a scratch. Then, two smaller horizontal lines crossing at a stick figure. It was crude, simple, and mocking. The figure stood there for another minute, watching us shiver, then lowered its hand. It reached down, and we heard a faint, distant, metallic scraping sound, as if they were adjusting something on the door's external latch. And then, the spring-loaded latch snicked open, loud and definitive. The door swung inward slightly, revealing the brightly lit, humid kitchen. The figure was gone. David lunged for the door and ripped it open, stumbling out into the relatively warm air. We stood in the kitchen, gasping, condensation steaming off our freezing parkas, looking wildly around the empty, sterile room. There was no one there. The kitchen was completely unoccupied. We immediately examined the door. The external latch was clean, nothing stuck in it. The red emergency alarm button, which was now clearly visible on the inside, was still jammed and completely unresponsive. "He unlatched it," I whispered, my voice thick with shock. "He was out there, he watched us, and then he let us out." "It's Frank," David insisted, rubbing his arms raw, trying to generate heat. "He's watching from behind the prep line, laughing." We searched the kitchen under the stainless steel tables, behind the huge ovens. Nothing. The only physical proof was the door itself and a tiny, almost imperceptible smudge on the exterior plastic window, the residue of a drawn stick figure. The shift ended at 8 a.m. We didn't report the incident. David was too embarrassed by the idea of being pranked, and I was too terrified by the deliberate, calculated nature of the trap. Whoever it was, they didn't want to hurt us. They wanted to exert power, to watch us freeze, and then grant us salvation. The following night, the dread was intense. I kept looking at the freezer door, imagining the figure on the other side. That night, around 2 a.m., David and I were cleaning the dish pit. We were both silent, tired, and jumpy. I yawned, wiping steam from the counter. I had been having trouble sleeping, haunted by the images of the previous jobs. "Alex," David said suddenly, his voice quiet and strange. "Tell me something. Did you dream last night?" "I think so," I said, cautiously. "Why?" "I had a weird one," he continued, still staring into the swirling steam of the dish pit. "I was trapped, but not in the freezer. I was in a room, and the door had those old, complicated knots tied on it like sailing knots. And it smelled metallic, like pennies." My blood ran cold. The knots and the metallic smell instantly linked back to the daily bread, a job David knew nothing about. "What else?" I asked, forcing the question out. "I was struggling against the door," David said, his brow furrowed in concentration, "and I could hear a kid crying, faint. And then I heard a voice, distorted and muffled, say, 'Too much guilt.' I nearly dropped the spray bottle." Every element David described, the complex knots, the metallic scent, the crying child, implied by the skate in Story 2, and the exact phrase, "too much guilt," used by Gasper in Story 1, was a detail from my own private, terrifying experiences at the 2 previous fast food jobs. David hadn't just tapped into my past experiences. He had experienced them with the same sensory detail. "I had a dream like that," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Almost exactly like that. But mine was about being trapped in the old donut shop, and someone was whispering my grandmother's lullaby." David looked up at me, his eyes wide and terrified. "The lullaby. I heard that too. Faint, but definitely the music box." We stood there, 2 men in the bright, impersonal kitchen, confronted with the impossible truth. We had shared a composite dream, a horrifying collage of the psychological intrusions I had endured in complete isolation at other locations. This wasn't telepathy. This felt like technological integration. The shared dream proved that the entity, or person, responsible for the initial freezer scare wasn't just observing us physically. They were accessing and manipulating our deepest fears and memories, possibly through some form of auditory or electromagnetic influence, targeting us directly. We realized the freezer incident had served a dual purpose: to observe our panic and to introduce the psychological conditioning that led to the shared dream. The initial locking was just a test run. We decided to monitor the freezer door ourselves. That night, at 3:30 a.m., exactly 24 hours after we were locked in, we hid behind a stack of bulk flour sacks, watching the door from a distance. At 3:35 a.m., it happened. The freezer door slowly, silently began to close. It was entirely possible the heavy door hadn't been secured properly, but we knew better. We watched as the door clicked shut and the spring latch engaged with a quiet snick. We waited, hearts pounding, to see the shadow appear at the window. 5 long minutes passed. The shadow did not appear. The kitchen remained brightly lit and empty. "He's not coming," David whispered, pulling out his cell phone. "We call the manager. We report the malfunctioning door." As David brought the phone to his ear, a low, mechanical whirring sound started coming from the freezer door. It wasn't the sound of the refrigeration unit. It was higher, strained, and rapid. The center panel of the freezer door, the thick, insulated metal, began to bulge inward, distorting the metal slightly. Tiny fissures appeared in the thick rubber gasket around the doorframe. The whirring intensified, sounding exactly like a powerful, industrial-grade motor running past its safety limits. "It's pressurizing the door," I realized, jumping back. "It's trying to collapse the door inward." Whoever was controlling the system wasn't just locking it. They were trying to violently breach the interior. We watched in horror as the pressure built, the metal groaning under the internal stress. The red emergency light inside the freezer began to flicker rapidly, like a dying heart monitor. Then, from the gap in the rubber gasket, a tiny piece of paper, folded precisely into a miniature square, was expelled by the pressure, fluttering onto the tile floor. The whirring stopped instantly. The pressure subsided. The door, though slightly warped, stabilized. David and I rushed forward, ignoring the residual cold emanating from the metal. We carefully picked up the tiny square of paper. It was cheap, grease-stained receipt paper, the kind we used at the register. Unfolding it was difficult, as it was compacted into a nearly solid block. Inside, written in minute, perfect block letters, was a single, devastating question. "Do you want to share your secrets now, Alex?" The terror was complete. They hadn't just shared the dream with David. They knew exactly which memory belonged to whom. They had used the freezer incident as a method of delivering a highly personalized, terrifying communication, confirming that they had access to everything: our location, David's cooperation, and my deepest, most private psychological history. We quit that morning, leaving the note on the manager's desk, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. The distribution center was just another technological shell that had been compromised. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person who locked us in the freezer wasn't a physical person at all. It felt like a network, an intelligent, persistent surveillance system that jumped from location to location, using the digital and physical infrastructure of cheap chain restaurants to find and terrorize specific targets. I learned that night that you can't run from the observer. Once they know you, every light switch, every phone line, and every heavy locked door becomes a potential weapon. I tried to distance myself completely from the food service industry after the distribution center incident, but after 6 months of struggling with construction work, I needed a steady income. I found a job that seemed completely safe, a family-run 24-hour diner, far from any corporate network or complex PABX system. This was the Sunrise Diner, greasy, warm, perpetually busy, and staffed entirely by real, loud people. The only technology was a basic landline and a 1,980 seconds era cash register. I started working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift again. Old habits die hard. The owner, Gus, was a massive, kind man who looked like Santa Claus. My partner was Chloe, an overreactor who believed in ghosts, curses, and conspiracies, which made her oddly comforting. The diner was busy until 1 a.m., then hit the ghost shift, a few truckers, maybe a cop, and long, quiet stretches with only the coffee pot's hum. The terror wasn't technological, it was auditory and environmental. Customers ordered at the counter or booths. Chloe or I wrote tickets on a duplicate pad and pinned them to a carousel above the kitchen pass-through. Old Man Finn, the deaf in one ear, grumpy cook, shouted orders back to confirm. 1 stack, extra butter. Or 2 eggs, scrambled. One Tuesday at 2:30 a.m. The diner was silent. I wiped the counter. Chloe restocked napkins. The door jingled, and a man entered mid-40s, gray sweatshirt, average build. He took the back corner booth, farthest from the kitchen. His clear, watery blue eyes and unsettling half-smile unnerved me. "Just coffee," he said, voice soft, almost musical. "I'm waiting for someone." I poured his coffee, noticing his stare fixed on the kitchen window. 10 minutes later, he sat motionless, still staring. The carousel spun once, unprompted, stopping with a blank ticket facing out. "Did you put an order up?" I asked Chloe. "No," she said, confused. I pulled the blank ticket, and Finn's voice boomed. "1 water, no ice. Coming up." We froze. The man had only ordered coffee. No one ordered water. His smile widened slightly. Chloe whispered about a diner ghost ordering water. I was skeptical but haunted by past surveillance experiences. Was this diner bugged? Unlikely, with its simple setup. We watched the man. Finn was back to scrubbing his grill, oblivious. 10 minutes later, the man waved his hand once, and Finn shouted, "Change of order! Scrambled! Easy on the yolk!" No one had ordered eggs. The man hadn't spoken or moved beyond that wave. I approached him, heart pounding. "Ready to order food, sir?" He replied, "Your cook already heard me. He's attentive to the room's vibration." His words chilled me. Chloe and I noticed his foot tapping softly under the table. Thump, thump, every 2 seconds. To test it, I wrote a fake order. 5 pickles, dry, and held it under the counter. Standing near the back hallway, I felt his tapping vibrate through the thin wall. Finn yelled, confused, "Pickles? Who ordered 5 pickles dry?" He wasn't reading tickets. He was echoing the man's vibrations through the diner's structure. The man was using the building as an amplifier, exploiting Finn's sensory quirks. He began issuing complex, impossible orders. A slight hand raise, and Finn shouted, "Turn the grill off!" Finn didn't act on it, but the command rattled us. He was testing how far he could manipulate Finn and us through suggestion and vibration. By 3:30 a.m., 2 truckers and Officer Davis sat at the counter. The man stood, moved to the booth behind his, and kicked the cushion, making the wall thwack. Finn screamed, "I can't breathe," clutching his throat in panic. Officer Davis drew his gun, demanding answers. The man smiled maliciously, tossed a $5 bill for his coffee, and said, "He's done. I got what I needed." As Davis ordered him to stop, the man waved his hand. Finn, still gasping, grabbed boiling coffee and threw it in Davis's face. The cop screamed, dropping his weapon. In the chaos, the man walked out into the pre-dawn mist. The police arrived to a chaotic scene. Officer Davis, scalded and screaming, insisted Finn attacked him maliciously. Finn, shaken, swore he'd felt unable to breathe, acting on an involuntary urge. The man in the gray sweatshirt was gone, untraceable. I told the detective about the strange orders, the vibrations, and the man's claim of using the room's vibration. He wrote it down, clearly skeptical, chalking it up to stress. The diner closed for 3 days for investigation. Finn never returned, too traumatized. Gus, heartbroken, struggled to keep things together. A week later, the diner reopened. I stayed, needing the money, but felt uneasy. Chloe quit, too scared. My new partner, Mike, a young college kid, was unaware of the incident. The first quiet night felt heavy. Around 2 a.m., I served an elderly couple in a booth, 2 seats from the back, hoping to avoid the vibration's reach. As I set their plates down, I noticed a faint scratch on the Formica table, a crude spiral with a jagged line through it. It echoed a symbol from my last job, a chilling mark of the observer. The elderly woman touched my arm, smiling nervously. "Are you all right, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost." I brushed it off, asking if they needed anything. She leaned in, whispering. We told the waiter, the young man with the beard, we wanted. Silence. Complete and utter silence. Mike hadn't taken their order. No one had. Yet, the diner was eerily quiet, no traffic, no hum from the Coke machine. The observer had placed an order for silence, forcing me to hear the void. I quit within the week, convinced the observer would always find me. I left food service for remote data entry, working alone in a new apartment, far from diners or freezers. But the threat wasn't the buildings, it was me. The donut shop, cafe, distribution center, and diner shared a pattern. Isolation, silence, and vulnerability during late shifts. The observer exploited this, weaponizing phone systems, walls, freezers, and now the diner structure as tools of terror. They knew my sister's debt, my grandmother's lullaby, my fears. They used guilt and history to unravel me. The horror wasn't robbery. It was the invasion of my mind. The man at the diner didn't want noise. He wanted silence, so I'd hear his presence in my head. Now, at 3 a.m., my apartment's phone sometimes rings 10 times before stopping. I hear faint metallic scuffs in the walls or feel a low-frequency thump through my desk. I wonder if someone's listening, waiting for me to break the silence and confess my guilt. The world is smaller, more connected than we think. On the midnight shift, you're never alone, just easier to find.